Greetings, everyone. As Audrey mentioned, my name is Ashley Johnson, the Director of Energy and Environmental Affairs here at MBR. And again, for those who were able to join us last night, welcome back. And to those just joining us today, we're very happy to have you participate in this conference on building sustainable energy transitions in the Indo-Pacific. This event is part of a larger project that we are working with the U.S. Department of State with on their Asia Edge initiative. And it builds off a series of discussions we had last summer and in early fall. In the first session yesterday, Ambassador Virginia Palmer, the Acting Assistant Secretary, laid out a number of changing U.S. priorities and kind of some revamped initiatives and how they're interacting with and continuing to build their relationships with partners in Asia. We had 4 excellent speakers who highlighted numerous considerations for leaders moving forward as they are trying to help engage on energy security and access in the region. And these included tailoring needs to individual countries, ramping up renewable energy investment to remain competitive, and contributing to and utilizing existing mechanisms that seek to accelerate decarbonization efforts. And it was a perfect tee-up for today's conversations. We'll first dive into considerations for energy markets and steps needed to update and revitalize some traditional approaches. Before I introduce our moderator today, I'd just like to send a few final words of thanks to our team here at MBR and our colleagues at the Bureau of Energy Resources, to our excellent speakers and moderators who have such a vast knowledge and are able to highlight and spotlight some of these key issues and considerations that we're discussing today. And then finally, of course, to you all for joining. We really appreciate your participation and your questions, as that really does help continue to dive into some of these issues here. Now, with that, I'm delighted to introduce today's moderator, Jeanne Choi. Jeanne is a non-resident fellow at MBR and a PhD candidate at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Jeanne's expertise lies in energy markets, specifically those of natural gas in Northeast and Southeast Asia, and is a perfect leader to guide this session today. So with that, Jeanne, thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, or good evening, or good afternoon. I think I've covered all my bases there. And welcome to our first panel today. Thank you, Ashley, for that very kind introduction, and to the NBR team as well for organizing this event. Thank you to all of our speakers, and for all of you for joining our second panel of this conference, Updating Approaches to Energy Markets. So I'll actually start by introducing our 3 brilliant speakers today. As per NBR conference convention, I will introduce them by name, title, and organization only, as their bios can be found in the materials that were sent to you for the conference in general. So our first speaker is Phoumin, who is the Senior Energy Economist at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Our second speaker is Pravakar, SAHOO, Professor at the Institute of Economic Growth in India. And our third speaker is David WOGAN, Assistant Vice President and Senior Researcher at the Asia-Pacific Energy Research Center. Thank you to all 3 of you for joining us today and sharing your expertise and insights on this topic. So I know some of you had the opportunity to join the proceedings of the first day of the event yesterday, the keynote address that Ashley mentioned by Ambassador Virginia Palmer, as well as our first panel on regional energy transitions in the Indo-Pacific. And I know that Ambassador and the panelists yesterday gave us a great overview of the strategic considerations being faced by countries in the Indo-Pacific in order to accelerate a transition to a more sustainable energy future. And as Ashley said, this is really relevant for our discussions today regarding energy markets on this panel, as well as the technical hurdles that countries will face as they transition on the second panel for today, which will be right after this one. As you can tell from today's agenda, this panel will look more specifically at energy markets as one such pathway to energy security in the Indo-Pacific. For those of you who have maybe participated or attended past NBR events, this is really an issue that we've explored in depth, the question of getting markets right as a key challenge for governments. And I should put right in quotes, I suppose. Market liberalization measures that increase openness, transparency, and competition are often needed to mitigate risk and increase investor confidence by developing a more efficient market with clear price signals based on supply and demand dynamics. Indeed, this is one of the pillars of the US Asia Edge initiative, really to create a more level playing field that is also conducive to mobilizing private capital for high quality energy infrastructure development. However, in some countries, selling these market reform measures to the public and to industry, while also ensuring economic development, continuing to expand electricity access, maintaining affordability and security of supply, that can be a true test. Governments in the region also need to balance the need to meet growing demand while also ensuring a transition to a cleaner energy mix. So, given these numerous objectives, which, as we were reminded by Ambassador Palmer yesterday, are not always mutually exclusive, how do countries approach these challenges? Reform often requires carefully considered policy formulation and implementation in order to meet these energy-related objectives while minimizing social and political costs, including potential resistance from vested domestic interest groups, which sometimes arises. This past year has also introduced some uniquely new challenges. And so I would like to invite our speakers. I know we're a bit fatigued about in some of these conference proceedings from either avoiding or just constantly focus on the impacts of the pandemic. But I think it is something that we should consider during this panel to discuss how energy markets and demand and supply outlooks have been impacted and what new and continuing hurdles need to be addressed. So without further ado, because I know the time always goes very quickly on these things, I'll turn to our first speaker, Phoumin, for his opening remarks. I'd like him to invite him to the floor by perhaps starting to give us an overview of some of these main challenges in Southeast Asia for policymakers and investors, including what areas that should be prioritized for investment given the on-the-ground realities and needs of the region. So Dr. Han?
Very good morning, and thank you so much, Jeanne, for a nice introduction for myself. I think thank you so much, by the way, for this opportunity that NBR has given to myself as well as to area, and thank for all the participants today. I think as the topic highlight today, I'm going to highlight key of the challenges in Southeast Asia, particularly ASEAN and East Asia context, if you like, about what actually the market approach in the market reform in this region, that in order to correct the market failure. This is important that if the region going to have a cleaner energy system as part of the road to carbon neutrality, I think the current setup, it will be very difficult for this region to transition to cleaner energy system. Let me start by highlighting that Southeast Asia is heavily dominated by fossil fuel, oil, coal, and natural gas. Almost currently 80% of the energy system are dominated by this fossil fuel. And in history, I think long time ago, since most of the Southeast Asia subsidized the fossil fuel, since, if I'm not wrong, since the 1968 onward. And once they already subsidize of this, because it's first, they think that it's important to provide welfare to people. They thought it's a very short term when they provide welfare, but they lock in very long term and very difficult to phase out the subsidy we call consumer subsidy. What happened in the context of Southeast Asia, once you subsidize it and then it becomes sensitive and politically sensitive, you difficult to remove. Once you remove it, it's not the right time. You see that people uprising, demonstration, and other. But in fact, there are no transparency in this energy subsidy. By number, I think in 2013, where my institution with the IEA jointly estimate in Southeast Asia around 51 billion US dollar has been subsidized on fossil fuel, particularly. And late estimation roughly around remain by 25 to 30 in the year 2018. So this number is still very high. For Indonesia alone, the subsidy, energy subsidy, particularly on fossil fuel for electricity and the petroleum, particular for transportation, remain very high, from 10 to 15 billion US dollar in this 2020. So I think the most highest subsidy in the Southeast Asia. And when we're coming back to, I'm not talking about how we're going to remove energy subsidy in transportation, but countries have been doing so in the past 10 years, and they have achieved greatly. Some of the fossil fuel has been removed. But the more important, difficult one is about electricity subsidy removal, particularly. And it's not easy to reform in this sector. First, we need to understand the structure of most of the electricity sector in Southeast Asia. They are mostly still we call hybrid model, which is a single buyer model where state-owned utility still control most of these assets, particularly generation, transmission, and distribution. And of course, they allow the IPPP to participate into this kind of the market, but quite small share. So when we think about the open market competition, there are hurdles in terms of how to attract new investment to modernize electricity sector, because when we talk about the road to cleaner energy system, you need to have more cleaner energy such as renewable, wind, solar, biomass, and others. But particularly wind and solar are known as mostly abundant in Southeast Asia. But when you increase the share further to electricity system, there are a bottleneck because it cannot inject further because of infrastructure bottleneck. You need to modernize this infrastructure, IT, and smart grid. And if the current setup, you cannot invite more investment into this sector. So a lot of things need to be done, I think, in terms of electricity reform. But the most important is that all the utility in the ASEAN government actually need to first, I think, to deregulate in order to allow electricity trade in the region. And then I think they should have a harmonized regulation, regional regulation, in order to allow electricity trade. When you have trade, you're able to penetrate more renewable. And of course, you can reform some of policy because it cannot be done overnight. I think I will stop here first because there will be many points I want to highlight, but I will take question and answer later on. But first, I think before I finish, a well-targeted subsidy is still important for Southeast Asia, particularly for vulnerable who need the electricity, who need the LPG and the transportation. But most of the time, the subsidy are not well targeted. They are blanket. So it's a waste of government resources, and it's often very huge burden. Sometimes this subsidy can cost more than any government expenditure, public expenditure combined, like education, defense, and other. So I think a lot of leakage on this. So it's important that the government have to work on this area in order to impact to correct the market failure, to say that market failure is here, and all here are the bottleneck to make reform. So once we know the issue, we can reform it, and hopefully that we can make a better energy system in Southeast Asia. I stop here, and then we'll take questions later on. Thank you so much. Jeanne, the microphone back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Han, for that great overview of the situation in Southeast Asia. You hit on a lot of the common themes that I know that perhaps have applicability in other regions as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. SAHOO for his thoughts on some of these issues in the context of South Asia.
Thank you, Jeanne. Actually, it's really a difficult time, but I'm happy to be here, and thank you so much for the opportunity. Talk about India's energy sector, which is third largest right now, and anyway, it's not very significant. So when I talk about India, give you a perspective, it would also capture most of the issues or some of the issues that are for the South Asian countries. When it comes to the energy sector in India, you know, third largest right now in terms of consumption. If you look at the report, International Energy Association, you know, still India's energy sector is quite dominated. As Dr. also made the point, is dominated by the, we depend 55% of our total energy from the coal, also almost 30%, around 80% of the energy sources are from wind. And, that is not something which is sustainable. Carbon emissions and climate change issues that really as an outcome. Look at demand and supply of energy in India. More is a period of maybe a couple of decades. We have reduced the energy deficit or power supply deficit 80% to less than 1%. So I think when it comes to energy security, they are much better right now, but still during the peak periods, there are 5 to 10% power deficit. So we have improved, but still we are yet to achieve what's called pure energy security. There are issues when it comes to intensity. Still, the energy intensity in India is relatively higher compared to China or other countries. So obviously, when it comes to efficiency of energy use to improve, and there the innovations, the investments, improvement in infrastructure facilities, I cover some of the issues. A lot of challenges. I just spoke about it. Coal and oil, the main sources of India's energy. India's coal content 45% low quality, so we depend more and more on high quality coal imported from outside, so that the cost of production goes up and the power company is actually arranged. When it comes to gas, also the issues. For example, the wholesale gas is and then from the wholesale price in consumer price goes up by double because of infrastructure or the taxes, central and state governmental. So there are issues, or what we call it. If we continue like the way we are doing, that is depending fossil fuel. The IEA says that India's emission to go by 50% till 2040, and that is the largest any big country. So the per capita emission would be lower, but still it would be higher. India is a country, the energy consumption is increasing. We also focusing on sustainable energy infrastructure or energy sources, but still we are very, very far. What we have done, we have made policy what is called nationally determined contributions. We need to reduce energy sources depending on fossil fuel by 35% by 2020. Some of the fronts we are doing very well, but at the same time we are heavily dependent on this fuel with the energy demand. For example, on the positive side, I can say that India expressed national contributions under Paris Agreement when it comes to solar power from solar. Power is energy from the power from solar energy kind of really it has gone beyond the expectation. A lot of places that again, whether it is reduction on solar panel, also reduction of tax rates previously. Now they have increased it. That is something not a good sign, but they have giving subsidies, and also the kind of steps they have taken for renewable energy quite impact when it comes to energy. Some of the government initiatives that have been taken as the last 5 years will the budgetary allocation for the renewable energy. One of some of the policies like solar mission, which subsidies on purchase of inputs or equipment for solar energy. set and have been made very important. The policies like obligation of state electricity acts to purchase from these renewable sources, and also renewable energy certificates. When it comes to facilitate the use of or of electricity vehicle. For example, the government has announced now that all the vehicles, all the four-wheelers that would be registered. That's only electric vehicle four-wheelers should be registered from 2024 onward, and all four-wheelers have to be electric vehicles 2026. So this kind of strong kind of move from polluting energy to environmental sustainable. And, there are a lot of steps that have been taken, and government was very aggressive. But unfortunately, this COVID happened in 2020, and the whole focus has been on the life and livelihood, and some priorities like the sustainable energy sources that have been, I think, more or less sidelined for the time being. When it comes in this potential, it's a huge potential. When it comes to solar, and nowadays we are focusing more and more on solar combined with batteries. A lot of investment. There is also a huge opportunity. Big investment, as far as I know, in Bangalore and other parts also, that India is going to be powerhouse when it comes to products that is used with the solar. India is also planning for energy like more and more on natural gas, which is increasing, but then there are issues. We need to realize the natural gas market so that investment is coming. But more or less, we have improved when it comes to renewable energy sources, but there are challenges. These challenges are not new. When talking about it, it's like offtake rates. It is basically making payments, non-payments producer, small producer of non-renewable energy suppliers, not paid on time by the electricity grids, need to have bad balance. The government has been working the state electricity grids so that the finances are better and they can really oblige to buy purchase on power generated from renewable sources. And lack of infrastructure is quite clear in developing countries, and most in India. As you look at transmission distribution in India, it is one of the highest among the. And if you look at World Bank indicators, the energy efficiency infrastructure India ranks very low. That's something that worries, and it's not only overall cost, it's about the sustainability of the whole power sector. So we need to improve the the energy infrastructure sectors. That's something where we need private sector to play, and of course government needs to invest more and more. When it comes to renewable energy sector, always feel there is very limited understanding in India when it comes to investments, financial intermediaries, or it is a non-banking financial intermediaries, or the financial institutions of private sector, foreign institutional investors. There is a limited education when it comes to renewable energy or sector. What government can do more, basically for the policies that comes to electricity vehicle, or if further can reduce the GST rate. I just recently heard that government has increased the tariffs on import of panels and other equipments from 25 to 40%. This kind of things would not really for what we call green energy, or it would not attract private players to invest in technology and energy. So, along with the GST reduction, we need to reduce down the tariffs on inputs or intermediate products or equipments that are necessary for energy, renewable energy sector. I see that it's basically renewable purchase and renewable energy certificates policies are very good. I hope they implement it more effectively so that it would encourage private investors to produce renewable power. IE report says that the kind of investment we need in renewable energy sector for sustainable development that is equal to $1.4 trillion by 2040. It's a huge investment which I don't think India can do it alone. That is where we need private sector participation in terms of liberalizations across different layers. So, one of the things that comes on the way is basically most of the policies named at the level and get clearance approvals in it's one of the best. So that is where it so that private investors come in because we need some amount of resources. And also government can try something like green bond, climate financing. There are a lot of sovereign funds. Also the private or managers are interested to invest in renewable energy sector. We can channelize or capitalize the opportunity. So basically, what I think is the transformation from this fuel-based energy to renewables energy sector, we need innovation. They need collaboration between private and public sector, the international collaboration happening in India, US, and all the huge capital. Some of the things which we need to private investment, ensuring non-discrete network access, invite private investors, work with states, implement policy and policy. Unless it's financially feasible, I don't think private sector really come forward and invest. So that is where we need to look at the policy or rationalize what we call in a feasible way, leave it to the market. Otherwise, it's very difficult to private investors. Moving away from government allocation of energy supplies to allocation of market forces of market pricing, and I think good to attract private investors both from domestic as well as from international market. Rationalizing subsidies across the expert for me, I think made a very valid point. We need to do that. It's a fair competition and there is a market for stakeholders. Further, because we are moving towards emphasis is given a lot on natural gas market, whether we can liberalize is a huge potential for investors. I think I will stop here and maybe I'll be happy to answer some questions. I want to give a brief review. And now it's over to you, Jeanne.
Thank you, Pravakar. That was great, and outlining the challenges faced by India. And I especially appreciated your discussion of how government policy support or in the case of India, sometimes tariffs can inhibit or encourage the growth of renewables in the country. So thank you for that discussion. So now we'll turn over to our third speaker, Dr. WOGAN, for his initial thoughts. I know you lead the APEC Energy Demand and Supply Outlook, so we're all eager to hear your assessment as well.
Well, thank you, Jeanne, and thank you everybody for this opportunity to participate today. It's a very interesting topic and one that's kind of dear to my heart, so very happy to be here. Today, I'd like to offer one way to think about, at least one way that I think about the role of energy markets and development goals. And then I'd also like to share some insights from a different region of the world to see if there's perhaps any lessons learned or successes or failures that may be of use for Indo-Pacific. So the first kind of concept that I think about is one of markets and rules. And the energy transition really is about, in some ways, a transition of markets and rules, whereas rules can mean things like subsidies or quotas or targets, but it could also mean market design, which also depends on the market and industry of interest. And so one of the big questions and challenges, I think, is how do these markets and rules evolve over time to reach some of the objectives that countries and nations have set? And in reality, there is a rich mixture of markets and rules that combine to serve objectives. And we've heard about some of them today from the other speakers. And some of these objectives may be in competition with each other. And so just one example that comes to mind is in Indonesia, I think. I know there are schemes to subsidize fuel for two-wheelers in the transport sector, but there's also incentives, I think, coming from the folks who do the power planning to incentivize electric vehicles. So there are things that may be working at cross purposes here. And so the first idea is really, how do these markets and rules evolve over time, and what does that mix look like over time? And the second idea is that policies are layered and layered over time. And so if one is thinking about reforming policies, whether it is reforming subsidies or introducing markets, changing market structures, then the sequence of unwinding policies is very, very important. And in the Indo-Pacific, along with many other regions of the world, governments have adopted policies and rules to encourage development of domestic industries or to protect citizens, which are also consumers and ratepayers. And over time, the quantity and interaction of these rules can become quite complicated. So rules can be layered upon each other, and it becomes quite difficult to unwind these. And so, and it seems that in general, societies tend to gain more rules than they subtract. And so this leads me to my third point, which is about analytical tools. And when considering subsidy reforms or market design or assessing costs and benefits of some of these investment decisions, it's, I think, clear to everyone that stakeholders need the most up-to-date and most relevant information to help support this decision making. And this helps to show some of the benefits of decisions given the complexity of layered policies and the mixtures of markets and rules that exist. And I'd just like to share one example from other studies that I've done, not with APERC, but in a previous life when I was a researcher in Saudi Arabia, and this is on the Gulf Cooperation Council, in particular the electricity sector there. And I think this shares some, the system there and the system of subsidies and government interventions share some similarities, I think, with some countries in the Indo-Pacific. And just for some context, the GCC is composed of 6 countries in the Arabian Peninsula, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar and some other countries. And it is a region rich in natural resources, oil, natural gas, minerals, etc. And the energy system, including oil and natural gas development, heavy industry and chemicals, and electricity production have all been a mix of heavy government intervention in the form of price caps on products, quotas and allocations of natural resources among firms and sectors, all of the familiar type of things that we hear and we see in the Indo-Pacific region. But more recently, there has been a move to more market-based structures, primarily to diversify the economies in the GCC nations, some of which brought on by lower oil prices several years ago. But the idea really is to diversify the economies by encouraging domestic, but also foreign direct investment. And these are key components. And so I think this may offer some useful lessons for the Indo-Pacific region. And looking at just one sector, the electricity sector in particular, we see that there are subsidies for fuel used by power generators, and on one side, but also price caps on electricity tariffs paid by consumers. So there's sort of interventions and rules on both sides of the equation. And this combination has incentivized inefficient investment decisions by the players, which tend to be state-owned enterprises. And so trying to unwind this system has implications and unintended consequences across the energy system. And it's key to keep in mind that it is an interconnected system. So even though you may be trying to reform or address one part of the system, there may be some other aspect that is affected. And so we found in the GCC region that moving to a more market-based power sector means revising how fuel inputs are priced. In the case of Saudi Arabia, this is from the mostly state-owned Saudi Aramco, which in turn affects its investors, one of which also is the state of Saudi Arabia, but also there are private investors. And this also means restructuring the power sector, the power company going from a vertically integrated company to unbundled actors. And perhaps most importantly, it means keeping the public in mind. And we heard this earlier, and I think this is a very, very key point. The public, they are customers and they are ratepayers, and even some of these countries, they may not be voters, but they do have a lot at stake and a lot of power. And this has led, in Saudi Arabia at least, to the creation of a different rule. So layering on another rule in the form of annual cash transfers to make citizens less worse off from the increased prices. And so I'll stop there, but hopefully this is maybe useful to maybe set some of the questions or conversation for later, but happy to answer or elaborate. Back to you, Jeanne.
Thank you for that introduction. I think it's especially useful that you brought in an example from outside of the region, because I know that some other markets outside the Indo-Pacific have made varying progress on their own liberalization efforts. So seeing if there are any best practices that we can bring back to the region is quite useful, I believe. So with that, I think we'll head into the Q&A portion of this panel. I will start us off by perhaps asking a question to all three of our panelists. One subject that you did all raise was this, the importance of subsidies as a powerful tool of the government that can be either used with positive or negative consequences. So I wanted to ask, I know, Dr. Han, you did touch a little bit on situations in which subsidies can be appropriate and indeed helpful, and especially when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable. I know, Dr. SAHOO, you talked about subsidies helping the renewable energy industry. So is there a way that policymakers can shape subsidies to capture the most benefits while minimizing market distortions, or will there always be a time later down the road where the chickens come home to roost and policymakers will have to reckon with the distortions that they've created? And also, Pravakar, if I could ask you, I know in India specifically, there's kind of the dynamic between the central government and states when it comes to subsidies can be quite unique. The national government setting the rules while the state has to implement them. And I know states sometimes do their own subsidies. So is there a way in India specifically to make these subsidies a bit more targeted and less blanket? So I don't, maybe Dr. Han, you could start us off.
So much, Jeanne, for this question. Actually, this is the most important that leader in energy policies in Southeast Asia as well as in the region has been thinking, I think, in the past decade. And then there has been done to some extent is quite remarkably well recently, that I think they have been phasing out transportation fuel particularly, but not really. I think they still remain a big problem there. They realize this is a huge burden. You're right, because any changes, most of the country in Southeast Asia, they use a kind of the stabilization fund to cap the price. But the problem is the most benefit is the rich people. It's not the poor, because the rich mostly use this transportation fuel more than the poor, as well as the LPG. I think in the case of India for cooking fuel, I think let Pravakar mention about that. But I think the more important is well targeted to the most vulnerable. That's the more important. I think the leader aware of that. But how to do the well target is a big issue, because you need to have a very good registration system and update who need this cross subsidy. For example, electricity sector, you need cross subsidy to subsidize the poor. For transportation fuel, for LPG, clean cooking fuel, who need to receive this subsidy? This is the most challenges, and you need to update who need to phase out from the subsidy. And mostly lately, what I understood from India, they are now for voluntarily phase out subsidy because they cannot identify who received the subsidy or not. So of course, to some extent, like Indian case, they have actually to some extent the LPG subsidy, to my understanding. But again, there's still remain a big issue. It's a market distortion to some extent because it discourage the mostly the renewable uptaking first, and mostly the fossil fuel subsidy is almost 8 to 10 times higher than the renewable. This is the context in Southeast Asia. So the proportion are not it's so different between the subsidy. And in order to encourage the investment in the renewable, first, removal or subsidy on fossil fuel, whether it's on consumer side or on the supply side, whether we call consumer subsidy or producer subsidy. And second, I think the market reform, rule procedure need to be there, because as I told already, it's not just put one policy is well, because the market setup doesn't allow new technology to come in, because they still favor old technology. Because let's say, take and pay principle, they lock in a very long-term contract. Even the power generator produce in the prediction is demand is lower than expected. Still, the utility pay for this power generation. So I think there are no chance for new technology that can produce cheaper to come into the system, because the way they arrange the contract already locked into a very something called wasteful thing, and then it locked into 25 years, 30 years. So a lot of these things, I think not only energy subsidy, the market structures is a barrier for new technology and clean tech energy. This I want to highlight, and I want to stop there. Maybe the colleague will have to compliment. Thank you so much, Jeanne. Yeah.
Dr. Wogan, do you oh, excuse me. Pravakar, go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with some of the points made by Mr. Khan. You know, it comes to subsidies, maybe initially it is quite helpful both for the supplier as well as consumers, but certainly there's distortions in the market. So over a period of time, we phase out. And we need to focus, if after we are giving subsidies, we should give subsidies, and improving infrastructure, we should give subsidies on really like equipments and other things, and also ensure that the subsidy part, which needs scale economies and cost of production, that is passed to the consumer. For example, government of India has been given a lot of subsidies for solar industry, on solar panel, GST, of tariffs, and that has resulted in increase in solar power. Right, it has brought down the cost of production, and now it has come up as a good industry. At the same time, it certain objectives in a democratic setup like rural electrifications, giving clean cooking gas, like Mr. has just pointed out. Here, you know, we are moving away from not putting material or energy to the what you call gas. So there, I think it is justified to subsidy, but the subsidy is not continued for a very long period of time. It creates certain distortions. But I do support subsidies, innovation on development of infrastructure, so that the efficiency in the sector really goes up, like the way we have done solar, wind, and other things. And coming to the second point, yes, the central government and state governments, it's a federal setup. So state governments have own power. Central government is very proactive when it comes to making policies, but implementations sometimes it lies with the state government. Coming to more targeted or more subsidies given to states, there are 2-3 things. So some governments, they do subsidies, like Delhi government is giving subsidies on use of power of certain limits. There is a popular move and it is meant for targeted group. At the same time, state governments, they actually tax and heavy tax on petroleum products because it is a cash cow. They get a lot of revenues. If we go by the point that we need to tax the fossil fuel-based energy, then it is fine taxing, but at the same time, it has implications across because it increases the cost of production, the transportation, and multiplier impact on the prices. So when it comes to state governments, they do give different types of subsidies, and it's a bit complicated actually. But yes, your point is right. I think we need to have a wholesale energy market, and there is transparency, and we need to reduce subsidies, particularly the cross subsidies, and make what you call more transparent energy market. The state governments, they have their states to have balance sheet problems, the financial problems, and other things. Some central government gives a kind of undertaking or helps them. But we need to do a lot more so that they are financially not only sustainable, but they are also encouraged for investment and innovation on energy infrastructure to move away gradually from fossil fuel-based energy sector towards the renewable energy sector. I stop here.
Yeah, I just have a couple of thoughts on that. I think one way to think about it is, for subsidies to be targeted and to minimize distortions, I think it's a good practice that they be essentially timely and flexible so that they can incorporate learning and be adapted as the state of technology or the state of industry changes. Perhaps one example is maybe in the United States with the wind production tax credits. Maybe it's a bad example. I don't know. It seems to be renewed every couple of years and seems to be a race to build new wind turbines. But the idea that it is not permanent and that there is some learning and flexibility and adaptation happening, I think is maybe a good kind of characteristic to have. And also, if we take a step back and ask, what is the purpose of a subsidy in question? Is it to provide economic support to, a part of the citizenry, or is it to encourage technology investment or support a nascent industry? And I think the answer, can change or be slightly nuanced depending on what the actual subsidy is. But I think in general, ideally, you want subsidies to be technology agnostic. Not to be a huge pessimist, but I'm not aware of many decisions where the government has successfully picked a winner, sort of at least in the energy sector around the world. And so I think you want to, with a subsidy, if you want it to minimize distortion, you want it to encourage investment or encourage certain behavior, but not necessarily pick the means to get there. You want to sort of set the incentives for the outcome. So I think maybe being timely and flexible is one way to do that. But I'll stop here.
May I just make one point?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
I just saw very appropriate pointed questions from Mr. Vikram. To be very honest, what he needs actually the numbers, numbers. Maybe I would really work and give the numbers that basically what is total negativity in the discounts. The discounts are having very bad balance for a long time. They're being supported by the state government and also the central government. What the scheme recently, in fact, it was launched, and some questions very relevant. And I would answer with numbers a little later.
So for those of you who didn't see the chat box, Pravakar was answering a question that we got from the audience, which was, what is the total negative equity in India's discoms? There are actually two other questions as well that I think it might be interesting to open up to our other experts as well. Namely, the second one, if renewable energy was brought on stream aggressively, what would be the total cost of retiring stranded assets? Dr. Han, it looks like you have some thoughts on this question.
Thank you so much, Jeanne. I think the question is rightly asked because when you bring the renewable on stream, at the same time you haven't thought about what will be the retiring strain asset. This will be very costly. So I think it doesn't need to be whatever in the pipeline. I mean, you need to improve whether it's going to be more efficient in terms of performance. Let's say coal power plant, you need to be more efficient, or you need to be, I think, upgrading in terms of emission removal on others. But it doesn't need to be retire too fast because they cannot generate the revenue. Who's going to pay for that? It's a consumer need to pay for that. And when you add more renewable in terms of wind and solar, particularly, they are not a base load. You need if system going to be redesigned, you need a battery backup, battery storage, or maybe you need on-site hydrogen, because renewable produce a lot of extra energy, and then they need to be curtailed, and those can go for hydrogen production and backup. So the cost very hugely. I think I'm not recommend to retire whatever on pipeline. Continue, but redesign the energy system landscape where renewable will come in more, and you retire those coal as and don't add more coal into the system. I think this is the best way for energy transition, because when you retire early, I think consumer have to pay more. The constraint is consumer in Southeast Asia, they are poor, they are not willing to pay. So there are no way that we do that. I feel that we need to redesign the whole system. This is what my recommendation. And second thing, I think for what is the appropriate fit-in tariff for renewable? This is also a very right question. In Southeast Asia, the government, the one who designed fit-in tariff. That's why we said, why they change the fit-in tariff very often? Because they lack of the knowledge and the technology development in terms of how the price of renewable reduction over time. So I think it's very important for their capability to understand the technology revolution and how cheap they are going to be. So in that case, they are able to issue the right fit-in tariff. I think that it needs capacity to assess that rightly. Otherwise, it's, I think, over subsidized. That point I fully agree. Thank you. That's
yeah, just a small point to add. Actually, in case of India, for unit solar lab or solar unit, used to cost, the cost of production used to be something like 12 to 13 rupees, but over a period of time, the economies of reduction of solar panel and of states government has taken the unit cost is something like 2 to 3 rupees. That is quite on an average comparable with the power units produced by other sources, whether it is coal or so I think it is always the innovation, the scale economies, and the overall efficiency that brings down the unit cost, and it is comparable now when I see.
I think this is a really great question. I think building on what Dr. Han was saying, I think, for state-owned assets, especially, the cost of retiring some of these existing assets, let's say, let's just presume that they're coal assets, will probably be borne by the taxpayers. And so I think this is, an important consideration about, retiring things too early. And so maybe it becomes a question of timing. And then you can think also, if these assets are owned by independent firms, then this may be sending a bad signal, or maybe an unintended signal, that by investing, you may not, your investment may not get you the return on investment that you were expecting. And so this may actually scare away investment. So I think you have to be, it's pretty complicated calculus, I think, trying to figure out when and how much. But I think it's a very great question. And it also got me thinking, there might be a paradox where the system, because depending on how the market structure is set up, there may be an instance where if a lot of these existing assets that have fuel costs and maybe expensive variable O&M costs are taken out of the system, and you're left with the system with a bunch of, let's say, renewable assets that have zero fuel marginal cost, then maybe you may be in a position where renewable investors may not be able to secure a rate of return based on a market rate. So I don't know. I mean, somebody would need to crunch the numbers on this, but so again, I think timing is quite important in thinking about who bears the cost on this in terms of the actual level of the writing down the assets.
These questions are really important. We need to really look at the numbers and find out the exact answer.
Great, thank you. So I know that there have been a few questions coming in on that chat. So another one is, are there any policies or actions foreign companies or public sectors can take to aid in some of these areas? For example, the deregulation of utilities, phase out of subsidies, or should they be resolved domestically? So I guess, is there a role for external partners? There's a lot of thoughtful expressions. I'm not sure if anyone has any immediate answers to that. Another question is, what are the best practices on improving liquidity in power markets and moving away from physical PPAs that India can learn from? So, Pravakar, if you want to, I think that question is probably best directed at you first.
I think we need to have the best practices followed across the issues, starting from mobilization of resources, the products, the efficiency to the distributions. So everywhere actually we need to work on. So that's where I focused on some of the issues, whether it is subsidy, whether it is off-taker rates, most of the issues we need to deal with, so that make them find a certain. There's not one issue or the other that would solve the problem what we face in energy sector. It is everywhere. It is whether it's input, whether it's production structure, and the distribution. Also, what kind of energy mix actually we need for the time, given that we have a target by 2030 we need to achieve this. How do we really put today's energy mix to this 2030? So the whole lot of issues are there, and that's I think the quick solution as such. We need to be working the way we are doing, maybe more aggressively from now on.
I see the question was amended to also include best practices from other countries and regions from which India can learn. So, Dr. Han, I don't know if you have any. Oh,
yes,
sorry, go ahead, Dr.
Okay, thank you so much. By the way, I think to improve liquidity in this electricity market is the more important, because you need to attract new investment to modernize the energy infrastructure, particularly for electricity sector, for both generation, transmission, and distribution. Because the bottleneck currently in Southeast Asia, as well as in India, what I understood correctly, I think the infrastructure need to be modernized. In that case, you need new investment. So the current setup, it will not attract new investment. So as I told already, that the market structure is a hybrid, where is the state-owned utility mostly controlled, where PPA contribute very minor, very small percentage, like 5% or less. So you need to have the free market competition where the more market participants can raise, I think, fund from public, private company and others. Because currently you see these utility always lose money every year as you ask them. And then that will not attract any new investment into this sector. So the market setup need to be gradually moving from this hybrid or single buyer to full market competition, that you allow more free player to participate, and you have to create a playing field where actually it's a more important electricity energy regulator, the one who produce, ensure that there are proper rules for market competition. And then the electricity, I think the, let's say, independent system operator can take in and ensure that that kind of rule and procedure can be implemented. But if they are not creating this all system, I think it cannot be done. So I think there's need a lot of reform to improve liquidity in this electricity market. I think this is the right question and timely for Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Just a quick to add on to that, I think that's a really great point by Dr. Han, and it sort of reinforces itself, because I think if you have an investment environment that is successful, you will draw in more investment. And so I think even getting back to the previous question about, you know, can it be from outside, maybe foreign investment or domestic investment? I think there's a combination. There needs to be some kind of balance there where you have reforms domestically, keeping in mind the domestic situation, which can vary by region and by country, but set up that environment so that you can attract investors, so that they can see a return, so that both parties or both sides essentially get the benefits that they're looking for. And I think if you do that successfully, then you're able to have a system where that reinforces and builds on itself. So just some quick thoughts.
Thank you. And we do have a few minutes left of this Q&A. So if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to use the chat box on the right, or you can also raise your hand and signal to me if you'd like to ask your question directly to the panelists as well. Actually, I'm gonna shift things a little and ask you a question that I've been curious about. A question on distributed generation and microgrids. Many countries still seem to have regulatory barriers that inhibit the expansion of distributed generation. And in the past, when it comes to expanding capacity in the Indo-Pacific, it's usually centralized approaches that dominate state-led action. I know that in countries like Bangladesh, for example, though, they have one of the largest off-grid solar programs, and it's growing every year. I know India has previously announced plans to expand microgrids as well, and some of those plans have made more progress than others. And so I'm wondering what market reforms are needed to expand energy access through distributed generation? Is it a worthwhile endeavor, or should we really be focusing on expanding through centralized approaches? Dr. Han, please. Yes.
Jeanne, I think you asked the very important question for this region as well. I think Dr. Twarath, actually, he's on board on distributed energy system. By the way, he can, I think, speak further. It's very important. I think not only in the context where energy access is limited, but even in the, the urban cities, we can also talk about the distributed energy system, because not only the way a distributed energy system can provide more security, but I think it become more efficient. It depends on how regulator can allow this distributed energy system to operate in a way, because I think when we talk about distributed energy system, you have to refer to what capacity, whether just for renewable or also for generator, a standalone generator. So I think mostly in the practice of Southeast Asia, like economic zone is operated by distributed energy system. And sometimes they excess electricity, they put back to the grid, and then they buy in only when they lack of energy. This has been happening in Thailand. And then we quantify this capacity based on each country, where country like Thailand is mostly have a grid distribution connect to rural area. Then when talk about rural energy access, it's not a matter, but distributed energy system have room to grow in Thai context and a lot of business opportunity for that microgrid actually. But when you talk about rural Cambodia and Laos, the context of distributed energy system are different. It's in terms of energy access. So in that case, policy design will not need to be just one direction. I mean, it has to be how to allow consumer to consume in a way that it's very fair energy, and because the system itself becomes cheaper and cheaper. And in that, I think that again, back to regulator, how they going to design the market system to allow the distributed energy system to grow further and further. And of course, it provides energy security, because even talk about cyber security attack, you cannot no longer rely on the central system. And it become less cost when you talk about remote area, when you cannot extend national grid to just for few households. So I think this is a very important issue that, again, all the policy design, that's what that they need to think about it, how to make it more fair and more acceptable in that individual context of the countries. I stop here. Thank you. Yeah.
If I may, on distributed generation, it's in a sense moving from a 20th century electricity grid to a 21st century electricity grid. And one of the barriers, I think, is that system operators and regulators have decades of learning and experience in the 20th century grid, where you have, physical assets, you have a lot of overcapacity that you can call on if there's some issue with reliability. Moving to a 21st century grid is a different paradigm that I think there's not a lot of experience. There's not a lot of learning that's been able to happen. And so there's more players. There's multiple directions of information flow. Instead of power just going one way, you have power going both ways, and you have information going both ways, and a lot more software. And I think, it may be sort of just thinking about the people actually who keep the lights on and keep the grid running don't have a lot of experience, and maybe a less trust, let's say, in software than physical things that they can call on. And so I think in some ways it's an issue of regulators and system operators and getting those folks up to speed and comfortable with some of these innovations that are coming, so that they can really support that to have. So in a sense, you're relying on distributed generation, but you do have a centralized kind of knowledge base to keep the entire system running. And so I think that may be something that's a little under scrutinized a little bit.
So over a period of time, I think, with the innovation and the information flow, and of course, like in case of India, the regulatory system, I think overall redistributive energy system has improved a lot. Maybe there are reforms required, but I think they're doing very well, I feel.
Great, thank you. I see we have 2 minutes to go. So I know that there was one last question that just came in, and I hesitate to introduce it at such a late time, but if you can give me maybe like your 30-second take on this last question. Do you think the market structure is depends on the regional national security situation? Compared with the EU, NATO region, ASEAN does not seem to secure the regional security completely. So just a quick take on that question. Maybe Dr. Han, do you have any thoughts on the ASEAN perspective?
Yes, thank you so much, Jeanne. Actually, the leader have a clear roadmap for the ASEAN integration in terms of energy. I mean, particularly for power sector, ASEAN power grid interconnection. Of course, I think they are embarking on the step-by-step toward these European, Nordic or US market, like how they're going to have regional electricity market. But the road to reach there, I think there are some, I think they work both in terms of system and regulation side, I think first physical connectivity must be there, and ASEAN actually is trying to work for bilateral connectivity. I think it starts from bilateral connectivity, and then after that you can do more modern bilateralized third-party access, and then go to multilateral trading. That is they hope fully. And both physical connectivity as well as the institution are currently being developed. And how far they're going, I think they're going to meet many reform in order that we often say that they need to deregulate in order to join this ASEAN electricity market integration, particularly for electricity. And actually, many of the policymakers, what kind of deregulation when each of country have their own problem, like you said, they have their own agenda. If they going to subsidize one, let's say, hugely on one thing, and how they going to do such kind of trading besides physical barrier and other. So I think the road, I think the future prospect is there. I think, but just a matter of how they going to resolve internal issues step by step. But whatever market structure is, I think the power trade can happen. I think first step by step. I believe that that's going to happen in the Southeast Asia context. Of course, it happened block by block. I hopefully that the Mekong sub-region will be the advanced power system, power market trading, and then it go to lower, middle, and then go to Indonesia part and others with Singapore and others. So I think it will happen step by step, by the way, and I believe that will be the direction in this region. Thank you for that question. Thank you.
Great. I think that is actually, we have run out of time, but that is also a good segue into the second panel, where they will be delving into more of these issues of how to go from bilateral to multilateral cooperation and potentially trade as well. So thank you for teeing up the next conversation. And I see we are a little over, but I know that there was a cushion built in by the very thoughtful organizers of this conference. So please join me in giving a virtual round of applause to our panelists, our experts who have shared their insights on this very important topic. Thank you very much to all of you for joining and for a wonderful and productive conversation. So I will throw this over to Ashley now for your.
Thank you, Jeanne. Again, thank you to Dr. Han, Dr. Wogan, Dr. SAHOO. Delighted to have you all join us. And really, I was taking lots of notes, so many good questions and things that we might consider. The points on flexibility and adaptability, particularly with such rapid innovation in some of these technology spaces. So a lot of exciting things to come. And as Jeanne noted, Dr. Han perfectly teed up our next session, which will get started pretty soon. We'll give like a 4-minute break. We'll get started maybe 1 minute late, but please do get more water, coffee, whatever you might need, take a walk, a brief walk, and we'll get started very shortly. But again, thank you all to our speakers and to Jeanne for moderating, and look forward to our next panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe.
I apologize for waiting for another minute or two. We have construction going on outside here in Arlington, so I'll be fluttering the mute button based on the jackhammers. But thank you all for being here this morning. It's good to see you, Astha.
Am I audible? Hi, Tom.
Yes, you are. Perfect. Good to see you as well, Clara. I know that we've got quite a range of time zones and everyone around here. Good morning, Dr. SUTABUTR. Or evening, I suppose. The classic start to these things is to cover all your bases on the planet. So I hope everyone's had a chance to get a little bit recharged. And I guess we'll get started on the second panel today. So thank you all for being here. It's very exciting personally as an energy and environmental person myself. Talking about renewable energy is something that I can do at great length. And even better than that is getting other more intelligent people to talk about renewable energy for me, which is what we're going to be doing this morning. We've just heard some great analysis on the market and investment requirements for achieving this renewable energy transition. So for this second panel today, we're going to be looking at more of the technical side of things. As domestic and regional governments start to transition their energy to more greener sources, they're pushing to clean up their grid, but doing so is going to require more than direct investments in renewable sources or other low or zero carbon energy supplies. Governments will need to overcome many technical hurdles like grid harmonization to allow cross-border trade, and other hurdles like increased flexibility through storage or through improved power management practices. So we've got some great speakers here today who are going to help us dig into some of those details. We'll be starting with some remarks from Ms. Astha Gupta, a consultant for the International Energy Agency. Ms. Gupta's expertise in renewable energy and energy policy, particularly in India, will give us a good starting point on some of the limitations, but also some of the potential for renewable energy sources to meet electricity demands and also demands of energy security. We'll then transition to Dr. Twarath SUTABUTR, Chief Inspector General at the Ministry of Energy in Thailand. Dr. SUTABUTR's work at the government level will give us insights into international grid harmonization and some considerations when trying to expand that regional footprint of the electricity grid across borders. And then lastly, our final speaker this morning will be Ms. Clara Gillespie, who is a senior advisor here at MBR. Ms. Gillespie will take the discussion to the strategic level and provide us some insights into opportunities for collaboration and how policies can help us overcome these more technical hurdles to renewable energy, which involve international players potentially. So, but before we get to that, I'd like to hand things over to Ms. Astha Gupta, who will start us off this morning. Astha.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. I hope you all are doing well and keeping safe. Unfortunately, India is facing really tough times with the pandemic and the second wave. We're just hoping that it's going to be over soon and just hoping for best days. And then I would like to take this opportunity to thank NBR for having me as the Asia Edge Fellow. And it's been truly, I've enjoyed the experience and I've learned a lot from all the experts here. So thank you again. So in my today's remarks, I would focus on the renewable energy policy in India, and then talk about some challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. India accelerates its ambitions for clean energy transitions. And if time permits, I can also talk briefly about the essays that I've been working on under the fellowship program. Well, it really ties well with the energy security and resilience story in India and South Asia. So we have some time left. So I'm sure with our great panel, before our panel, all the great speakers have already talked a lot about the renewable energy story in India, but I would just want to very briefly highlight what India has achieved so far. So close to 93 gigawatts of RE installed capacity, which contributes to about 20% of the total installed capacity in India. That's where we are, and the possible measures or policy measures that had led to this achievement is, of course, starting from renewable purchase obligations, which there are for state distribution utilities, to competitive bidding process, where you're arriving at really low tariffs like 1.99 rupees a unit, and then easing all your administrative procedures and clearances to provide for land acquisition, your investments in the grid, or through our Green Corridor program. So all of this then led to large deployment of solar parks and wind parks in the country. So with this background, there is also an ambitious target that India holds, 175 gigawatts of RE by 2022 and 450 gigawatts of RE by 2030. And at the onset of this pandemic, the country also decided to have, the economic recovery measures, which included India to become more self-reliant. And they have been promoting a new production incentive link scheme to produce high efficiency solar PV modules within the country. So just to promote domestic manufacturing, there are direct investments that the government is putting into this project. Overall, what they're trying to do is trying to substitute the imports from different countries, make India more reliant. And also this could generate jobs and employment, direct, indirect, which is one of the, as part of our recovery measures. This is very key in that sense. So while we have all of this, the targets, the installed capacity in place, there is obviously on the demand side, if I talk about, with increasing demand of electricity in the country. Now this goes beyond the electrification program that we have, a massive one. There is also increasing demand in the buildings for air conditioning load, in the transport sector for the electric vehicles program. And all of this demand will be very dispersed, distributed. The centers are not, in a centralized manner, but they are very distributed, and so is the supply. So when we talk about our rooftop program, which hasn't taken up very well, but then of course it will get accelerated in the few years. Again, your supply options will be very distributed. So how do you then technically manage all these hurdles? So the challenges which will still remain and may restrict the achieving RE goals in India. So I think the one which has been talked about largely is the integration challenges. So the RE integration challenges, how you increase the flexibility of grid operations, considering you have the inherent nature of RE being intermittent in India, wind energy being very, very seasonal in the monsoon period, even the hydro. So, how do you manage the flexibility options that you already have? That actually could lead to RE curtailment, and it has been, like a lot of states have been experiencing that. So, of course, there are technical challenges on the grid side, but there are also challenges which has been talked about a lot in the previous session, which is on the tariffs. Because electricity tariffs, again, very complex in the country. States get to decide them. There is a large amount of cross-subsidization. There is an additional subsidy element by the state government. So how do you tackle all the tariff-related issues? And then linked to that is your discoms, which are financially stressed. So of course, there are distribution losses, technical losses, which are in place, but then, not having real robust metering infrastructure, I think, so is also a very key challenge, which the discoms faces and even will be important for tariff design. And again, there is a lot of work which needs to be done on the regulatory side and the price signals which are not really there. So all these challenges are really there. Although the central and state governments have overcome these challenges over the past few years, bringing more regulatory innovation. We've had very innovative options, like round-the-clock supply options, which have been taking place. We have tried solar wind hybrid options. There has been an aggressive smart metering rollout, that's happening in the country. There is billing out of distribution companies, and even with RE, there is a must-run status in the country. So that's where RE was very, very resilient, even during the pandemic time, where you saw the coal consumption decreasing drastically, and then RE is still supporting because they had the must-run status. So there has been challenges which have been overcome by the governments, but what I still feel that there are more opportunities which the government needs to tap into. One majorly is on the regulatory and remuneration framework for the new technologies like storage. Pumped hydro storage, battery storage has really good potential in the country. So how do you really bring those technologies, within market system? How do you have more remuneration, better frameworks, regulatory frameworks? That's something where the government should tap into. Of course, making the tariffs more rationalized, reducing cross subsidies, all of that is important. But while you are improving the smart metering infrastructure, you can always use price signals, time of use tariffs to enable the demand response, considering your demand will be now dispersed distributed. So how do you make sure you can bring that into the picture? Also, there is equal opportunity that the government sees on the use of low tariffs of RE to produce green hydrogen. So there has been a lot of green hydrogen being talked about in the country. But now with the low tariffs, there's focus to produce green hydrogen. That was really a big opportunity in the country. So I would try to just rest my opinion there, and I'm happy to take any questions afterwards.
That's great, Astha. Thank you so much. And don't worry, I will get back. I have a lot of questions about what happened in Texas earlier this year, but we'll get to that in the Q&A section. For our next speaker, we're going to move to Dr. Twarath, who will be giving us some of his government experience. So Dr. Twarath, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Tom. First of all, I would like to thank the NBR again for inviting me to join this panel. And I also would like to thank my colleagues and speakers in the earlier section that has a very good lead-in into the topics that I would like to present. Well, the topics that I've been given, maybe the next slide, please, that I've been given is about, meeting the renewable energy goals in Southeast Asia. But, there are many things that need to be done concurrently to make sure that the goals are met or the goals can be met in the future. Part of them can be non-technical. Some part is basically political. Some part is about mindset of the leaders of the governments or company, energy company that invest in the region. Renewables energy in Asia somehow is very domestic led. It's about domestic issues, and we are lucky that we have abundant resources of all types of renewables energy, like the hydropower in Malaysia and Laos, geothermals in Philippines and Indonesia, wind power in Vietnam, solar power in Thailand and Cambodia, and biogas for almost every country has a tremendous amount of resources. But again, there are some technical issues that need to be addressed, and I hope that going forward, these technical issues can find a way to be resolved, and I will talk about that more on which is the issue of the grid, because the main reason, the main topics about this is about mismatching, because we have a lot of resources scattered around, but the main market of electricity in Southeast Asia, like in Bangkok or Singapore, they don't have a lot of options. They need to sourcing all the resources or the electricity or the electron that they can have into the market, and how to link those resources into the market is the keywords. And I think the previous session just mentioned about the market reform, about the 21st century grid, and about more of the smart technology into the system. But again, my main topics today I would like to present is one of the key tools that could help Southeast Asia or ASEAN meet the renewables energy goals is the ASEAN power grid, or the interconnection to these 10 countries. And as Dr. Han Phoumin mentioned, that we already on process to have the collective connections of the bilateral grids into the system, but it's not integrated into one piece yet. It's still a piece by piece type of batching. But I hope that within 10 years, things like this can be integrated. And right now we have a multilateral trade that could bring power from Laos, transit Thailand, and go to Malaysia. But unfortunately, it's still a one-way direction. It needs to step up a little further to do a two-way directions. And it could expand not just only 3 countries, it could expand to Singapore, maybe connected to Myanmar and Cambodia and Vietnam, and have this, the Greater Mekong sub-region grid as the possible power pool in the next 10 years. Next slide, please. And just next slide, please. Just to give you an update that most of the grid at the moment is connecting what we call a project to grid type, is 1-to-1. So it's one project in Laos and connect to the Thai system. So somebody would say jokingly that actually it's a Thai power plant, but it's in neighboring country. And dispatching based on the Thai, totally in the Thai system, which is still a very fundamental before we stepping up to have a real power exchange or power pool type of trading. But I think there are five key elements that need to be done to improve the issues of getting more renewable energy into the grid. The first one is modernizing the grid. Because the grid in one country can be very good, and a grid in another country can be very bad. For example, like in Southeast Asia, in this map that's showing to you, I think Myanmar grid is pretty weak. But the Thailand grid, the Vietnam grid, and the Laos grid are quite okay. But so the upgrading the grid need a lot of investment. And I hope that, if we could sit down and find some kind of funding mechanism to help, build the grid that need to be done and link it together and modernize it in such a way that it could be totally integrated into one. It could be a physical platform for a commercial trading in the future. The second portion is about the market operator. Because right now, the market of electricity trading in this area is just only bilateral power purchase agreement. So if it needs to be two-way trading, and it needs a system operator and market operator that is a unified based in one institution. Because right now, each country have its own electricity utilities. Sometimes they cooperate together, but sometimes it takes a long time to do one little things. So if there need to be a unified market operator and also as a unified system operator into supervise this grid. The third component is to have a model and trustworthy power purchase agreement, because once you get into the grid, there would be a lot of commercial contract, and a trustworthy power purchase agreement is very key words, because right now some of the power utility in my neighboring country basically go bankrupt, and the PPA within that country need a lot of renegotiations. Okay. The fourth element and this is a pretty difficult one, but I think it's a doable, is to identify the supplier of last resort, which may tie into the the large energy storage, because if you have a lot of renewable energy, either solar and wind or hydro into the system, you need some kind of a supply of last resource to stabilize the grid. And we don't have that type of commercial arrangement for this type of the power plant yet. Last but not least, but I think it's a big issue, and it has been touched by Dr. Phoumin in the last session. He mentioned about, if you let the renewable energy power into the grid more and more, some of the power plant, some of the existing power plant would be stranded. And that would cause also the stranded into the gas contract, for example. So, for example, like my country, Thailand, we already overcommit in the off-peak period. So we already pay for power we not use. So if we have to consider that more power, more renewables energy into the grid, they have to demonstrate that there is a lot of benefits, either in terms of environmental benefits or some other type of commercial benefits, to make sure that it could outweigh the cost of this stranded asset and stranded contract. And I hope this could be resolved soon. But the COVID make this thing worse, because the COVID evaporate all the demand. So it make things a little bit tougher than we anticipate. So this is my take. My keyword is, to meet the renewable energy goals, you need a strong grid, and this grid need to be interconnected so we can transport the electron from the abundant supplying to the market that we need. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taurath. We'll definitely be coming back to some of those questions of how storage plays a role and how storage and an improved grid can interconnect with one another. But before we get to the Q&A session, we're going to move to our last speaker this morning, Clara Gillespie, who will be sort of giving us some of that bird's eye view of some of these problems. So take it away, Clara.
Thank you, Tom. And I guess to dive right in, so over the past year, NBR has been working with Han Phoumin's organization on a major study related to strengthening power sector outlooks in South and Southeast Asia. And while the mandate of this study was much broader than just renewable energy, some of the particular bottlenecks and challenges that we found were particularly acute when it comes to that question of how rapidly and how successfully countries might be able to meet, achieve, and exceed their renewable energy goals. And there are 4 points that I want to touch on in particular from this research, and then we can come back to some of them as well in the discussion and Q&A period. The first is that question that's come up a couple of times on getting to the right electricity mix. And from the perspective of technical barriers, this is not just the question of, do you have a strategic vision for what you want renewable energy to do in your electricity mix, or specific targets for how much you might scale up in a near term. If we were having this conversation even, I think, just 5 years ago, it would be very different. But now you see that virtually every country in the region has offered some kind of strategic plan as well as specific targets to it. India, of course, is really a champion on these issues in terms of its overall ambition, but you see even countries that, sometimes we put developing countries with lower electrification rates in this bucket of, well, they have to focus on affordability or increasing access before they can scale up on renewables or do a broader transition to a clean energy mix. We're actually seeing accelerating ambition in these parts of the region too, including Cambodia, which I now believe has set a target to get about 20% of its electricity from renewable energy sources within the next decade. So if the question is not that, I think the bigger issue has become for this is, do countries have in place some of the policy planning tools they need to deliver on these visions, specifically in translating them into specific near-term benchmarks, as well as more granular roadmaps. And there are a couple things that go under this. It's everything from, do you have a single agency in your country empowered to coordinate across not only the government bureaucracy, pulling in resources from your economic development team, from some of your other industrial assets, from the environmental industries, but also effectively coordinating from with the private sector as well on some of these issues, given the important and prominent role that it's envisioned playing. There's also a significant point that shouldn't be overlooked on ongoing challenges related to improving basic energy modeling as well. And this is a really important sticking point for understanding not just, can we get to, for say, ASEAN, this 23% target for renewable energy, but what is that actually made up of? What does that demand picture look like? And concurrently, a number of questions for improving historical statistics, data, access points, a number of areas that have to be addressed before you can get to that question of how you translate this into a more specific roadmap in the way ahead. Which brings me to my second challenge, which is the question of, do you have that infrastructure in place that's well suited for delivering on some of these renewable targets? And our previous speaker touched on a number of points that fall under this. This is not just modernizing the grid, but in some cases dramatically expanding it, improving distribution and transmission infrastructure, as well as a number of questions related to energy storage so that you're able to effectively manage the intermittency with wind and solar in particular. In our preparation for today's session, Tom had this fantastic question in his briefing materials, which was, if we think about the storage question as well as some of the grid questions, that kind of lingering, stated, sometimes unstated point of, well, just how much of a role can renewable energy play and under what conditions? What are the actual barriers to the technology under the current state? These barriers continue to matter in a number of ways. I think our previous speaker gave a really interesting insight into some of the ways that you can manage how much those matter, including by proving your integration both at a national level and international level. I would also want to underscore, though, that there are a number of countries that continue to leave potential on the table. There's a lot more ways that countries might be able to scale up on both wind and solar in line with the existing infrastructure that they have. And here I'll return again to Cambodia as a potential example of this. I know Courtney Weatherby at the Stimson Center has looked quite extensively at the country's energy planning and noted that it might be able to achieve up to 10% of its electricity mix with renewable energy under the current grid if certain other conditions are met. And those conditions involve things such as improving weather forecasting, so you can better predict some of the variability that you have on not just wind patterns and solar radiation, but also questions such as hydro potential and how seasonal droughts and others might affect other elements of that grid. As well as just strengthening overall demand management tools so you can more effectively move energy around to where it's needed, as well as reduce excess demand. But a lot of those issues get to the third challenge that we identified in this study, which was the question of improving human capacity to actually deal with some of these questions. This is the point where I think I'm very glad to be, as the American on the panel, also the last speaker, because there's a tendency in some of these conversations to take this focus very quickly to the question of transferring developed country knowledge to developing countries. And while there's an important aspect and element of that in this conversation, I think it also can do, if we only focus on this, it can do a disservice to the leadership that we already see in various parts of the region to address some of these human capacity questions. India, of course, we heard about on this session. ASEAN as well has been looking to develop several roadmaps and strategies for tackling human development tasks, both outlining its priorities for skill training, but also helping to identify resources within the region and how to pair various countries on these efforts. I think the other thing in this conversation that gets at a little bit of what David said in the previous session is this is also not just a developing to developed conversation. It is that moving from the 20th century understanding of energy to the 21st century understanding of energy, which means for human capacity in particular, thinking about this as a institutional change challenge as well. A number of countries are increasingly well-resourced on some of the more traditional demand management, utility operator side questions for more traditional power plants such as coal-fired power and others. The question is, how do you both improve their ability to think a little bit differently about some of those demand management strategies? How do you retrain them? How do you address the fact that for many of us, the technology has moved quite quickly. And so, if you graduated even, 7 years ago in these areas, the tools and techniques that you might be able to apply are very different. And then we talk a lot about the role that the private sector can play in these conversations. I also want to do a quick little in defense of government as well, which is for all of these, skill training questions and capacity building elements. Yes, there's an important role that public-private partnerships can play in this, but also a very important and challenging question related to retention within government policy planning. And maybe to just go to my fourth and last challenge, which is the big thing that cuts across a lot of what we're probably all thinking on this, is where does the money come from this? We've already talked about the incredible scale that's needed on investment across all of these fronts. And I believe our speakers yesterday also very thoughtfully hit on some of the work that DFC and other finance organizations are doing in this space. There's an aspect of this in terms of catalyzing investment that goes to question about how to improve some of those market fundamentals, which I think Jeanne's section did a really beautiful job of overviewing. So maybe instead, I will just limit myself here to underscoring both what was one of my central takeaways from that session and what I hope is one of the central takeaways from my remarks as well, which is there are times that what countries need is more than just a loan. The financing matters, but particularly when you look at renewable energy projects and some of the challenges in addressing their own risk profile, the project margins, the expected return on investment profile is very different from some traditional fossil fuel plants. And so if you bring back in those other challenges as well, to the extent that you continue to struggle on other aspects such as how to execute projects or even address some of the above ground political risks, those can all be a negative tailwind on some of these projects that isn't actually aligned with what's there on the technical potential. I know I'm running short on time. I feel like one thing that I'll just briefly mention, and we can come back to as well, of an example of something that cuts across all of these challenges and is particularly difficult on the renewable energy side, but also energy projects generally, land management questions, whether you're talking about siting issues, how you make sure you develop the appropriate environmental impact studies, to thinking about the actual acquisition processes as well. And all of these can be very complex, complicated questions that to the extent they drag on, they can reduce the viability of projects, but also not align with some of those broader strategic goals. I focused a lot on kind of the less than international level challenges, and maybe to just do about 30 seconds more, maybe 45 seconds on what Tom mentioned at the outset for my remarks, One of our primary goals in convening this study was to better map some of these challenges to what's already going on in the region on the international front, on a couple of strategic initiatives to see where, if at all, there were areas that the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, things like Asia Edge, might better align with regional interests and needs. And to do the very short version, the feedback that we got was the question, the challenges that I've just described are often not that new. And so the issue is often less doing something radically different, but how we do so much more and more dramatically in a very short window of time, where you might have not only the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, but organizations such as ASEAN and the East Asia Summit playing more prominent roles on a number of these fronts. And I can go into that more in the Q&A, but I'll turn it back to Tom for now.
That's great. Thank you so much, Clara. I was, I'll be dating myself here, but I remember distinctly when I graduated from undergrad in 2014, so exactly 7 years ago, the conversation was completely different, right, that we were having. And I think that it might help sort of transition a little bit to our Q&A to talk about the fact that in those 7 years, really, it has changed from problems that we will have at some point, right, to problems that we're now having to definitely think about as the grid changes and as these renewables become a larger and larger portion of our energy mix. So now we're going to transition to the question and answer portion of the panel. If you have questions for the panelists, then please type them in the chat box over on the right-hand side of your screen. And I will do my dead level best to get to them in a timely manner. But I think I wanted to sort of circle back around to some of the stuff that Astha was talking about. She mentioned, and she dove into a little bit more in some of her research for the Asia Edge Fellowship, which she did, which had to do with questions of energy security. In the United States earlier this winter, Texas saw one of the most disastrous failures of its energy grid that we have seen in this country. And a lot of political and also technical questions got asked as a result of that, but maybe to sort of contextualize it, I wanted maybe ask you to talk a little bit about some of the questions of reliability and energy security that come with a greater share of renewable energy, and maybe how there might also be some advantages to more renewable sources that we sometimes think of as the less reliable, the variable, and maybe to sort of flesh some of those ideas out.
Tom, so I mean, I would just say that for renewable energy, I think I missed this point during the remarks, is that we often underestimate the potential of distributed and decentralized energy sources, which not only holds real reliability potential, but then they have also been seen participating as solutions in providing resilience in the country. So whether it is extreme weather events or whether it is pandemic, all these distributed energy sources, if planned in advance, have shown, what benefits you could get if, your grid falls off, you've got blackouts. During the pandemic where, there were a lot of issues on the health infrastructure side, that how do you make 24/7 electricity supply in the health infrastructure, because that's where the requirement was. So from my perspective, I feel that the role of distributed and decentralized energy sources, along with sector coupling for health sector, agriculture, we often forget all of, the benefits these energy sources can bring in. So how do policymakers can align their investments or incentives and planning to more like a sector coupling? Because, of course, we are all energy experts. We're working on the energy sector, but the reality today is the pandemic, right? So, and today is the pandemic. Tomorrow could be an agricultural farmers' protest or whatever. The country can face a lot of other issues. So, how can you build in energy? Maybe and I think the renewable energy still holds an important place in aligning the goals of the other sectors, and especially the distributed. And Similarly, when you were talking about the Texas even. So I think, so of course, you know, there was major fuel disruptions which has happened, and obviously because of the weather linked demand which increased. So, you know, you've got a winter storm which was not expected in that particular area. So, you know, all your demand just increased because it was too cold. And then your supply, your fuel supply got disrupted. So how do you make investments on your system level? Again, this grid was very, very, I mean, they didn't have the regional connections. The operator did not have the regional connection. So, you know, how do you make that regional trade happen in the country? Because if your system breaks out, how can you then have regional flows which can flow? But at the same time, while we are talking about regional interconnection, it's also important that your grid could stand islanding of the, you know, if, like your areas could be islanded, so that if a grid fails out, you have microgrids, you have distributed energy sources to power the communities, you know, who really need supply at that point of time. So I think so both of these aspects would play an important role when you talk about security and resilience moving forward.
Oh, that's great. I don't know if Clara or Dr. Twarath had other inputs there. Otherwise, I think I might pick up on some of what you were just mentioning, Astha, and go into some of those questions about distributed generation. I believe that, so if you can spread out the footprint of your renewable sources and interconnect them, then you can reduce some of the problems with the variability that comes with those sources. And not to put you on the spot, Dr. Taurath, but I think that one of our previous panelists mentioned that you might have some thoughts on this. I welcome thoughts from others as well, of course, but Dr. Taurath?
Sure, thank you, Tom. Well, distributed generation can be classified as two categories. The first one is the pure off-grid, the purely off-grid. And the other one, it could be, the embedded, but it's the embedded microgrid or mini grid that embedded, still connected to the national grid. The distributed on the off-grid issues, that's another animal. That's another category that need to be addressed. Like in my country, there are several islands that need electrifications. And right now, most of them are diesel generator. So there's a potential there. But again, it needs some kind of a regulations and right now in my country, we talk about, again, but I know you don't like this, but we talk about some cross subsidy, because some national grid might need to subsidize all these mini grids. And there might be some kind of a mechanism that could be done. But about the embedded microgrid, that's a different story, because I think the concept is behind the meter concept. So it would make this premises like it's just one area that they have their own system operator, and they can exchange power within the area. But if there's a condition of they need more power, the national grid become the supplier of last resort. So that would be, supply injecting into the grid, but at what price? Because it doesn't go through regularly. It just injected on occasionally. So we need to have a new design of the tariff on this. And in Thailand, we have a few pilot projects on this, but it should be going faster than this without COVID, because right now the COVID not just only evaporate demand, but it just erase all the potential projects, and and we hope that we will pick up soon.
Great, thank you, Dr. Twarath. A key theme that has come up throughout today's panel and through the rest of the conference is this issue of energy storage. And I don't want to tip the hand too much. There will be another panel tomorrow for us and possibly a following day for some of our participants, but that's going to dive into some of the considerations that come with the issues of energy storage, particularly through changes in supply chains and things like that. But I wanted to maybe lay a little groundwork here today and ask our panelists, what is the timeline that you see for how quickly we can get what seems to be the key missing component to integrating a lot of renewable energy sources, which is better energy storage, whether that be batteries or some other way of storing that electricity which you generate, perhaps when the price is too low or when the energy needs to be curtailed. So what is your feeling on the timeline and maybe the scale that energy storage is going to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years?
Well, I can go first. Actually, I think the time is now. My house is powered by 16 kilowatt solar panels, and I have 33 kilowatt hours energy storage battery. Unfortunately, made in China, but it works well. It works well. Unfortunately, this April is very wet April for Thailand. Actually, April is the hottest month of the year, and it's supposed to generate more than enough electricity. Because when I built my house, I plan to export some of my excess electricity to my mom's house next door, and with no charge. But again, I do believe that the time is now. The matter is how could we, bring the price down and make sure that the supply chain is in the competitive manner. I know there's some kind of a geopolitics on this, but I hope that supply chains of key battery technology will not be monopolized, similar to what happened in the solar panels industry.
I can just add to what has been said. I agree that the battery storage is required right now, especially for countries like India, where at one place you're trying to transition away from fossil fuels, coal, and then how do you make sure that you integrate RE resources to the grid? So you want to move away from coal, you want to flexibilize the coal generation. At the same time, you also want to do away with the subsidies on the fossils. You want to eradicate, diesel genset. So, all of this, there needs to be a substitute. Of course, the battery prices should go down, and then it makes more sense. But both for behind the meter, I understand what co-panelists was saying, that most of the microgrids are still running on the diesel generators. So how do you make sure, if you want to transition towards renewable energy-based microgrids, it doesn't need to be a hybrid with diesel. You have to go beyond, look into hybrids with battery storage. And even when we're also having big programs and plans for electric vehicles, I think so there's again an opportunity of having batteries in there. So for India, it's right time. So we should just start. There has been policies around manufacturing batteries in the countries, and a lot of government investment. The kind of, they also want to do like a bidding process that has been done for the solar power plants. So, but of course, it hasn't yet been implemented. But of course, when you say, the time is definitely right now. Again, depending on which state, if there are states who have more potential for pumped hydro storage, that should be more preferred over battery storage. So, it also depends on what resources are available locally and what makes more sense, what is more cost effective. So, having all that cost benefit analysis should be done before, we adopt a technology.
To add my 2 thoughts as well to the great remarks there. In terms of the timeline, I feel like I am often wrong in guessing the pace of technological change, and sometimes I am pleasantly surprised, and other times I am disappointed, not just because the breakthroughs themselves come a little bit more slowly than anticipated, but because you can have some of those supply chain disruptions, other geopolitical questions that can alter some of the actual viability and scalability of some of these projects as well. And again, not to touch on what I assume the people tomorrow will be talking about, just to look at what we've seen during the pandemic already is that for a lot of renewable energy technologies, yes, there are ambitious plans for scaling up national manufacturing capabilities, but trade is still important to, expected to play an important role in that. And disruptions to trade do happen, as we've seen during the pandemic, which can slow or delay project timelines. So I would just add that in addition to wanting to see countries really push forward on accelerating breakthroughs in battery storage, whether you're talking about roles for national labs or other research groups, important to push forward on some of the tasks that make those breakthroughs have to do less of a heavy lift. So that can be, again, some things on the demand management side, thinking more carefully about how you want to partner wind and solar with other cleaner energy sources, including the thing we've skipped over a little bit as well, which is the role for hydropower in this as also a renewable energy. And then maybe lastly, just some of the grid interconnection issues of storage matters much less if you have more ways to move energy from where it's being generated to where it's needed.
Tom, I would like to add one more thing about the scaling up of the battery storage technology. There are 2 markets. One is the stationary to support the electrification of household, and another one is the electric vehicle. And most of the time, the electric vehicle become, a mass production type. And at the moment, the business model is that you need to promote the you need to promote the EV, the electric vehicle first, so that you can have a gigafactory. And once you have a gigafactory, then you have part of that portion to sell to the stationary market. So, but right now there are some countries, like for example, like my country, the market is not big enough to have 1 gigafactory. Maybe India, China, Indonesia has, big enough market to host 1 gigafactory of battery, but a smaller size of country need more breakthrough and maybe a new kind of a business arrangement to make sure that the battery could be cost competitive, and the supply chain to setting up the battery factory or gigafactory can be done in a country like Thailand.
That's fantastic. I'm personally very interested in how the 2 things are going to play out, because the technology is fundamentally fairly similar, but there are obviously different considerations on both ends. I wanted to maybe follow up on that a little bit through asking maybe first, how do we maybe power the rising use of EVs through renewables, and can we incorporate that increase in demand into national energy plans? And I also wanted maybe to call out at the risk of targeting Clara here, but there's also this idea of pairing these different portions of the energy sector. I think that a lot of that comes down to technology. And so maybe if I know that you've done some excellent work on smart cities and on big data management, and how maybe that could play a role in sort of pairing two things which to this point have really not, the transportation sector and the electricity sector have really not been as paired as they could be in the future. So apologies for the somewhat rambling question, but so I guess maybe to catalyze that a little bit, Clara, maybe if you wanted to, it looked like maybe you were just about to jump in there, or.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because for smart cities in particular, it's all of the challenges that we've talked about so far, but more, right? Because now all of a sudden you're not just trying to coordinate all of the assets within the energy sector or within the transportation sector, but in theory apply both, and then also bring in different things related to residential and other industrial real estate as well, so you can apply it in multiple ways. How you get that right? In my own research, I feel like I'm very early in this stage. But again, maybe in defense of good public policy, there are a lot of things that only really move once you can first set the right regulatory environment or the right laws in place. So for example, on smart cities, there are a number of countries, South Korea, which I'm in right now, Taiwan, various parts across both India and then also Southeast Asia. I know Malaysia and others are looking at what the laws they need in place, as well as who's the appropriate coordinating authority. Are you talking about a city government who's going to then be tasked with bringing in different conversations from other planning assets, and is that the right level? Do you need more of a national strategy so that someone who has, again, the greater depth of capacity or can look across cities can help coordinate that in different aspects? Regulatory wise, in some cases, this is also going to require significantly more comfort with experimentation and flexibility. Again, you see in South Korea and some other countries the creation of regulatory sandboxes to say, if we want to move more aggressively on autonomous or electric vehicles, for example, what are some of the business as usual regulations on transit management that we might waive, but only under these set conditions, only in this set area, and while still managing what was the original goal of these, which is safety, security, and environmental progress. That's a lot more questions maybe than actually specific things. I think that's also accurate to where some of the debates are at right now as well.
Absolutely, it's
maybe I can add a little
very
bit
much a
about the
developing
smart city
topic. Oh, I'm sorry,
and
Dr.
the
Twarath.
integrations of the concept of
You're having a
having
little trouble hearing you.
100% renewable energy in that city. The critical thing is about the digital infrastructure. Can you hear me? Good. Okay. The critical thing of building a smart city is the digital infrastructure and how to manage a lot of data, how to manage big data in that city. So like Kara mentioned, that it needs to be a regulatory environment, it needs some kind of data protections, but also the integration of energy, distributed energy system and the digital infrastructure in that city. It's very critical. We have some sandboxes here in Thailand, and we try to promote a power exchange within that small city, and again, it's still an embedded type of smart grid. They would like to become 100% off grid, so to make sure that they have more than enough that they require and export some to the grid. But actually, once they started, they found out that on the off peak or during some time, they had to import more than what they thought. and you know, the regulatory on who's going to pay all this is becoming quite an issue. So I think smart city would be a new challenge, but definitely it's a frontier territory that it could be a catalyst that drive more renewable energy penetration into the system.
That's great. I do want to make sure that we also cover another key component of these hurdles to renewables, which are these questions of grid harmonization and more of the handling of power grids in a more traditional sense, rather than this energy storage question. So maybe I feel like I'm picking on you a little bit, Dr. Twarath, but you alluded in your comments to this agreement between this three-party agreement between Laos and Thailand and Malaysia on international power trade. So maybe if you could dig into a little of that, how it came about, what exactly it is, who gets paid what to do this power transfer.
Okay. Well, it start off from Thailand has the power purchase from Laos only, and then Thailand also has another power purchase with Malaysia. So I think 5 years ago there's an idea about how about if Malaysia buy directly from Laos but transiting the Thai system. So right now, it's basically a commercial deal. It's nothing to do with technical or harmonizations of the grid at all, because actually the electron of Laos never go to Malaysia. It's the electron that produced in Thailand that actually produce it down, and basically it's a commercial deals. But the negotiation is mainly on the wheeling charge of how much would Thailand charge as a transit country and how much Malaysia is willing to buy. And I think they start from Malaysia has a quite high avoided cost. They produce locally a little bit more expensive than what they can buy from Laos plus from Thailand. We charge very small amount of a transit and wheeling charge on this, and I hope that it could expand. It is a pilot project, has a limited time of 2 years, and right now we are on the second phase that would like to expand from 100 megawatts to 300 megawatts. But again, as I mentioned, it's still a one-way type. There is no type of real exchange. But I hope that within this, soon future, thing like this could step up. The next potential target would be integrate Singapore into the system, because Singapore, the electricity tariff in Singapore is quite high, and there would be more potential to bring power from Laos or Myanmar through Thailand and Malaysia and sell it to Singapore. And also Singapore has another project on the news that they would like to seek opportunity of buying solar power from Australia. And if that happened, that would be great. That would be another big transmission line from down under to link to Singapore. But that's on the news.
Absolutely, aspirational, but hopefully it'll come to pass. Astha, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but I do want to get maybe some thoughts of yours on India as a possible power trading partner. I know that India and some of its neighbors with greater hydroelectric sources of electricity do have some limited power trading arrangements. So what would that look like maybe in India? Is India focused more on its own domestic production of renewable energy? Is India trying maybe to export some of its renewable energy? Just maybe a few thoughts from you there.
Yeah, so very well, we already have bilateral agreements with many of our neighboring countries, of course, more on the hydropower. But recently we've also had, like, we are trying to broaden the, the cross-border trading with the neighboring countries. So, India's taking a lead on that. We're kind of preparing regulations around that. What would be the technical, the connection standards which should be in place. So I think so. I mean, there was a plan for this, but it hasn't really got implemented. So there has been task force for the South Asian region, which has been formed, where India has been leading it, but there hasn't been. We've not seen a lot of implementation happening. In fact, I've just recently noticed that Nepal has been included in our power markets. Where they can also trade power. So that's a new. Yeah, that's something which has happened recently. So Nepal could be then participating in the Indian power markets for power trade. So that's happening. But I think so in the South Asian countries, there are issues domestically which the countries need to solve before they really go out there and really have a complete regional trade or regional cooperation on power trade. Of course, that's important, and that is going to optimize the energy sources. And of course, there are energy shortages in the whole region as such. So that could be very useful. But then, how do you make sure your tariff systems or your regulations, your connectivity standards, and your domestic demand, all of that is being catered through, and then then you can move out and explore the regional cooperation. But of course, I've seen India be taking a lead, but on the implementation side, there hasn't been much that I can. And in fact, domestically, there has been still more demand domestically, where the interstate transmission studies are happening, just to see with increasing renewable shares in the grid, how the transmission upgrades need to be done. So, I mean, there's a lot of focus which still needs to be done in the domestic market in India, and then of course, going cross-border.
No, of course, it's always, I did some research in India, and the added layer of the state and the national sort of borders always add an interesting wrinkle to the discussion. We're getting towards the end of today's Q&A session, but I did want to offer and I did want to point out that we have been in the chat asking for a few of your responses, for a little feedback from our participants. So if you wouldn't mind taking just a couple of moments to fill some of those out. But I also wanted to just close with maybe a last round for our panelists, if they had any sort of concluding remarks or thoughts on the overall trajectory and where we sit in the region in terms of more renewable energy in our electricity grids.
Can I go first?
Absolutely.
Well, I guess the renewable energy is up and coming. It definitely is on their way to become a mainstream. So a kind of a cooperation, close cooperations among countries, either the government side, private sector is very critical. And I guess the forum of exchange views and experiences like this is very good because from my side, I think some of the country think that renewable energy is very domestic policy, but right now it become it become global. So more of a platform to exchange views and idea could be good. I touch on this a little bit, but I won't touch it too much because I kind of scared that if renewable energy would become part of the political tensions between the U.S. and China, that could maybe slow down some of the development that it should be further along. For example, I think there's some fight over the dams over the Mekong River, for example, and some part of the geopolitics on the supply chains of solar panel industry. I hope that if there is no conflict, we will move faster. So I do believe that if there is the world that you can bring everybody together and sit down and talk and make sure that things would go smoothly and we find a common interest, I think we can achieve these renewables goals globally very soon. Thank you.
Maybe just to add on that, if the potential is not only strong, but very viable in terms of our ability to move fast, I think it also continues to be quite surprising. And, I was reflecting on one of the questions that came up in the last panel on feed-in tariffs and kind of how you structure those appropriately, particularly for renewable energy. This is something where Japan, as one example, structured a very thoughtful, in-depth policy around feed-in tariffs. And then what happened all of a sudden is you had the price of solar in particular come crashing down, new breakthroughs in technology that exceeded what you saw in other parts of the market, and all of a sudden a need to recalibrate that feed-in tariff to be more effective to the original design. So one of the things that I would just highlight for this topic in particular is the need to think about energy policy in terms of the flexibility and really kind of close monitoring of just what is going on if we're going to maximize that potential.
I will pick it up from what Clara last mentioned. So of course, flexibility is one of the keys to unlock the renewable energy potential in the countries. The more flexible options you have, with the changing grid operations, I think so it's very important that, you have a basket of options, and with India being so diverse, state versus center, different resources stationed differently, even in South Asia, where you have topography issues, there are geographical challenges. I think so. I mean, flexibility definitely will hold the key, and within flexibility, I feel the distributed energy sources, demand response, considering the new disruptive technologies coming in on board, like storage or electric vehicles, they will equally play an important role. So, how do you manage the flexible resources? How do you bring in and show the socio-economic benefits of distributed energy? So, for countries like South Asia, reliability, resilience, also socio-economic benefits. You move beyond access to households and incorporate other actors like enterprises, businesses. All of them can be supported with such distributed energy sources. So I think so. All of that mix can be very important. Of course, there is a lot of potential, but investments, I think so, is another key, which is going to make all our goals achievable. So timely investments is something.
Excellent. A good series of notes to end on, and teeing up some of the continuing discussion that we're hoping to have at the rest of our conference. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of our participants who are in the audience. It's been a real pleasure, and we really hope to see you at our third, I'll avoid the date conundrum, but at our third day and our fourth panel discussion, where we'll get into some of the supply chain issues and issues with renewable supply chains in general. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Thank you to Clara and Astha and Dr. Twarath. Thank you, Ashley, for teeing us all up. And we really appreciate the feedback that you gave us. We'll be incorporating that going forward. And so only 5 minutes over time, which in my book is generally a win. So thank you all so much for coming out, and we look forward to seeing you at the rest of our conference.